You ever had that feeling when you walk into a new job and realize, yeah, this is going to be rough? Well, that was me, except my new job was being shipped off to a medieval castle. No cool welcome package, no orientation slides with a smiling HR rep. Just me, a sack of hand-me-down clothes, and the knowledge that I was basically signing up for a life of back pain. So how'd I end up here? Let's rewind. My family wasn't exactly rolling in gold coins. We weren't starving either, but debts pile up fast when you've got too many mouths to feed and not enough fields to harvest. Some families sent their kids to monasteries. Mine, they sent me to the Lord's castle. Honestly, I think they were just happy to have one less person fighting over bread at the dinner table. When I first saw the castle, I swear my jaw nearly hit the ground. The thing looked like a giant stone beast squatting on top of the hill, all towers and walls and arrow slits staring down at me like eyes. It was intimidating, but also kind of exciting. I mean, I grew up in a wooden shack with a leaky roof. This place had walls, real, solid. You can't poke a hole through them walls. I thought, maybe this won't be so bad. Oh, poor innocent me. The gatehouse was the first test. You'd think walking through a big wooden door would be easy. But no. Guards stared at me like I was a stray dog. One even poked my sack with his spear, like I was smuggling chickens in there. Spoiler, I wasn't. Not yet, anyway. The smell hit me next: hay, horses, and something that could only be described as old boots dipped in manure. Welcome to castle life, kid. Once inside, I followed a grumpy steward who looked like he hadn't smiled since the last crusade. He gave me the rundown in the fastest, most joyless tone possible. Something about rules, chores, and how if I messed up, I'd be scrubbing floors till my hands bled. Great pep talk, really motivating. But the real fun began when I met the other servants. First lesson, there's a strict pecking order. Kitchen workers looked down on scullery maids, stable boys thought they were the kings of manure, and everyone bowed and scraped when the steward walked by. I was at the very bottom, basically human dust. One older servant, a wiry guy missing half his teeth, leaned in and whispered, "Don't cross the cook. She's scarier than the dungeon rats." Noted. The kitchen itself was a whole other world. Huge fireplaces, cauldrons bubbling with who knows what, the air thick with smoke and sweat. The cook barked orders like a battlefield commander, and everyone jumped. When she saw me, she gave me a once-over that could curdle milk. Then she shoved a bucket into my hands and told me to fetch water. No hello, no welcome aboard. Just go. So off I went, bucket in hand, feeling like a knight on a very stupid quest. And let me tell you, those stone corridors, they echo like crazy. Every footstep sounds like a marching army. The walls were damp, the air smelled of mold, and I kept getting lost. I swear those passages were designed to confuse intruders and new servants. Eventually, I stumbled back with water sloshing everywhere. The cook glared, muttered something about clumsy oafs, and set me to peeling vegetables. At least that job didn't involve hauling buckets half my weight. By evening, I was running on fumes. I'd scrubbed a floor until I could see my own reflection in it, only for some knight's muddy boots to undo my masterpiece in 2 seconds. Classic. My reward? A chunk of stale bread and a thin stew that tasted like it had been boiled 3 times too many. While the lords and ladies dined on roasted meat and fancy pies, we crammed scraps into our mouths like starving rats. That night, they showed me to my sleeping spot. Don't picture a cozy bed with a wool blanket. Think straw mattress shoved into a dark corner. It itched, it smelled, And if you moved too much, you'd hear squeaks. Yeah, rats. I whispered to myself, this is fine, totally fine. Character building, right? But as I lay there, staring at the wooden beams above me, I thought about everything I'd seen in just one day. The towering walls, the echoing halls, the endless rules, the people already sizing me up. This wasn't just a place to live, it was its own little universe, with strict order and invisible lines you never crossed. And me? I was the newest ant in the anthill, expected to work, obey, and vanish into the background. But here's the thing, I wasn't sure I wanted to vanish. Sure, I was a servant now, but part of me was curious. What secrets did these walls hide? What gossip flew through the halls? And how close could I get to the life I wasn't supposed to touch? Of course, at that point, I didn't know what I was getting myself into. All I knew was my life had changed forever, and I had just stepped into the castle's never-ending grind. If you've ever complained about waking up early for school or work, trust me, you had it easy. My day started before the sun even thought about rising. No alarm clocks, no snooze button, just a bucket of cold water dumped over your head if you didn't get up fast enough. Yeah, that was the medieval wake-up call. We slept in what I'll politely call the servant cave. Straw beds, snoring bodies everywhere, and an aroma that could knock out a horse. Someone was always coughing, sneezing, or mumbling in their sleep. And just when you'd finally drift off, the steward's booming voice came echoing down the hall. Up, up, work waits for no one. My first thought every morning was the same. Do I really need survival this badly? First stop of the day, the kitchens. Fires had to be lit, cauldrons filled, bread dough kneaded. The cook was already there, stomping around like a general preparing for war. She carried a big wooden spoon like it was a weapon. Cross her, and she'd whack you with it hard enough to make you see stars. I once saw a boy drop a pot of milk, and she chased him halfway across the hall, waving that spoon like a sword. My job? Haul water, always water. You'd think castles came with plumbing, right? Wrong. If the Lord wanted hot baths, water had to be carried bucket by bucket from the well. By the time I dragged one load in, I was sweating buckets myself. And don't even get me started on stairs. Whoever designed castles clearly hated servants. Narrow, steep, endless stairs. Carrying 2 full buckets up them was like being sentenced to your own personal workout torture chamber. After water came the scrubbing. Floors, pots, pans, you name it, I scrubbed it. And if you didn't scrub well enough, you got a lecture about filth spreading disease, which to be fair wasn't totally wrong. This was the Middle Ages. Disease was basically a roommate. The schedule was strict. Every hour had its job. Miss one and the steward would be breathing down your neck. And oh, the punishments. Drop a tray, that's a whipping. Burn the bread, no dinner for you. Answer back to the cook, might as well dig your own grave. Discipline kept us in line, but man, it made for some grumpy servants. Meals were, let's just say, uninspiring. Breakfast, if you're lucky, a hunk of bread and maybe some watered down ale. Lunch, porridge that tasted like sadness. Meanwhile, we're in the same kitchen, roasting chickens and seasoning stews for the Lord and Lady's feast. The smell alone was torture. Imagine preparing a table groaning with food and then being handed the scraps that fell on the floor. I remember thinking, if I were a dog, at least I'd get bones with a little meat on them. Despite all this, there was a strange rhythm to the day. The servants moved like gears in a giant machine. The steward barked, the cook shouted, and somehow everything ran smoothly enough to keep the castle alive. It wasn't glamorous, but you learned fast or you didn't last. And relationships? Oh boy, every servant had their own personality. The cook, like I said, was terrifying, but deep down I think she cared, at least enough to not let us starve. The steward was a walking thundercloud. He didn't smile, didn't joke, didn't even blink too often. But if the Lord praised the household, you could almost see his chest puff up with pride. Then there was the stable boy who thought he was the king of horse poop. He'd swagger around smelling like manure, bragging about how he knew every beast by name. Congratulations, my guy. You're best friends with a donkey. The kitchen workers were a bit friendlier. Between chopping onions and stirring pots, they whispered gossip about the Lord's family. Who wore what, who said what, who looked at who across the hall. Servants were basically the medieval version of social media. If you wanted the news, you didn't ask a knight, you asked the girl peeling carrots. But make no mistake, life was exhausting. By mid-afternoon, my arms were noodles, my back ached, and I still had hours left to go. And evenings were the worst. The nobles loved their feasts. That meant carrying platters bigger than my torso, weaving between tables full of knights, praying I didn't spill gravy on someone's fancy tunic. If I did, let's just say I wouldn't be telling this story. There was one night I'll never forget. I was balancing a tray of roasted meat when one of the knights stuck out his boot. Whether it was on purpose or not, I don't know. But I tripped, and the whole tray nearly went flying. By some miracle, I managed to steady it, but the hall erupted in laughter. My face burned hotter than the kitchen fires. The steward glared at me like I'd committed high treason. And the knight, he just smirked. Lesson learned, servants are entertainment too. When the feasts ended, we cleaned up what felt like a battlefield. Bones, spilled wine, broken cups. Then we dragged ourselves back to our straw mats, bodies aching, clothes reeking of smoke and grease. Some nights I was too tired to even eat my scrap of bread. I'd just collapse and let the rats scurry around me like, hey, neighbor. And yet, weirdly, part of me started to adapt. The rhythm of the day, the certainty of chores, it gave life a kind of order. There was no guessing what tomorrow would bring. I already knew: wake, haul, scrub, serve, collapse, repeat. My world had shrunk to the size of the castle walls, and everything outside them felt like another universe. But deep inside, I kept a tiny ember of hope. Maybe things would change. Maybe I'd climb the ladder, earn a better position, or maybe, just maybe, I'd stumble into one of those secrets the castle walls were surely hiding. Because here's the truth. No matter how strict the grind, no castle is ever just stone and rules. There's always something more lurking beneath the surface. And little did I know, I was about to find that out. By the time I'd survived a few weeks in the castle, I started to get the hang of things. Don't get me wrong, life was still endless work, aching muscles, and the occasional rat stealing crumbs from my pocket. But once you know your way around, the castle becomes less of a scary stone monster and more like a very complicated, very drafty home. The place was massive. From the outside, you just see towers and walls, but inside, it was like a whole town crammed into stone. You had the kitchens, the buttery, the pantry, the great hall, the Lord's chambers, chapels, storerooms, the armory, and of course, the dungeons. Basically, a medieval shopping mall, if your idea of shopping is hauling buckets and avoiding getting whipped. The kitchens were still my main battlefield. Fires roared day and night, and the air was always a mix of smoke, meat, and sweaty servants. But when I wasn't scrubbing or hauling, I liked sneaking quick looks around other parts of the castle. Some spots were grand, some terrifying, and some just plain weird. Take the Great Hall. This was the crown jewel, the stage where nobles showed off. Long wooden tables stretched forever, with banners fluttering overhead, and a giant fireplace that could fit a whole cow. When it was full of lords and ladies, the place glittered with color and laughter. But for us servants, we mostly saw it when it was empty, just a cavern of echoes where we swept and polished until it was ready for the next big show. Then there was the armory. Now, I had no business being in there, but curiosity is a strong disease. Imagine row upon row of weapons, shiny swords, spears, crossbows, helmets that looked way too heavy to be practical. The knights strutted around like peacocks, clanking in their armor while we tried not to laugh. Honestly, half of them looked like they'd tip over if someone sneezed too hard. But they carried themselves like heroes from a bard's tale, and I guess in some ways they were. The dungeons. Yeah, that place was not for laughs. Cold, damp, and echoing with sounds you didn't want to think about too long. The smell? Let's just say you could lose your appetite for a week. I only went down once to deliver food, and I swore I'd never volunteer for that duty again. The prisoners looked at you with eyes that said, "If I ever get out, you're first." Nope, hard pass. But here's the thing. Servants had access to places nobles didn't even think about. Secret passageways, narrow staircases tucked behind walls, trapdoors leading to storage cellars. They were like hidden veins running through the castle, and only the lowest of the low used them. We called them shortcuts, but they also came in handy for sneaking gossip. And gossip, let me tell you, was the lifeblood of servant life. Oh, the stories that flew around those smoky halls. One day it was, the Lord's daughter has her eye on a visiting knight. The next, the steward skimming extra wine from the cellar. And the feasts? You wouldn't believe half the stuff we overheard while pouring wine. Who insulted who? Who drank too much? Who stormed out in a rage? If Twitter had existed in the Middle Ages, servants would have been the trending page. Of course, while nobles bathed in luxury, we were living the opposite. Imagine hauling trays of roasted venison and spice pies past the great table, then going back to gnaw on bread so hard it could break your teeth, or watching the Lord's children parade in silks while you're wearing the same wool tunic that hasn't been washed in, well, ever. The contrast hit you every day. And don't even get me started on hygiene. Baths, rare. Soap, a luxury. Lice, oh, constant companions. You'd scratch your head so much you'd think ideas were crawling out of it. Sickness spread like wildfire. Coughs, fevers, stomach bugs. If you made it through winter without catching something nasty, you counted yourself lucky. Still, there were moments of strange wonder, like climbing up to the battlements at dawn, sneaking a look over the walls as the sun painted the fields gold, or hearing the sound of trumpets when a tournament was announced, the whole castle buzzing with excitement. Servants weren't allowed to watch, of course, but we found ways, peeking through cracks, standing on barrels, whatever worked. Watching knights joust was like seeing legends collide, except half the time they just fell off their horses in the mud. Honestly, that part was my favorite. What struck me most, though, was how the castle felt alive. Every stone, every hallway had stories. You could almost hear whispers in the walls if you listened long enough. Some folks said the place was haunted. I didn't doubt it. After all, so much happened within these walls. Births, deaths, betrayals, celebrations. It was like the stones themselves had memories. For us servants, the castle was both prison and shelter. Outside, the world was dangerous, bandits, famine, war. Inside, at least you had food, work, and some measure of safety. It was backbreaking, sure, but it kept you alive. And after a while, you stopped thinking about escape. You just accepted that your whole life was bounded by these walls. But acceptance didn't mean peace. In quiet moments, when I was alone sweeping a corridor or staring into the fire, I couldn't help but dream. What if I was on the other side of the hall, wearing silk instead of rags? What if I wasn't scrubbing plates but sitting at the high table, drinking wine instead of fetching it? Dreams were dangerous, though. Servants weren't supposed to imagine themselves as anything but servants. And yet, how could you not when luxury was right there in front of your eyes every day? So yeah, life behind the walls was a strange mix. Hardship and hunger on one side, glitter and gossip on the other. We lived in the shadows of the nobles, always watching, always working, never really belonging. But deep down, I knew the walls hid more than just nobles' secrets. And sooner or later, I was going to stumble across something that changed everything. By now, I thought I had castle life figured out. Wake before dawn, break your back, try not to spill soup on a knight's lap, collapse into straw, repeat. But the castle had a way of reminding you that no matter how much you learned, one wrong step could ruin everything. It started with the stew incident. The cook sent me to fetch a jar of spices from the pantry. Easy, right? Except on the way back, I accidentally brushed against a shelf and knocked over a small pouch of dried figs. Before I could scoop them up, another servant hissed, "Careful, that's the Lord's." Too late. The steward stormed in just as I was gathering them, and suddenly I was standing there, red-faced, looking guilty as sin. "Stealing from the pantry?" he growled. My stomach dropped into my boots. Stealing was a serious crime. They could whip you, brand you, even toss you in the dungeon. I tried to explain, stammering about clumsy hands, but he wasn't buying it. He marched me in front of the cook, who folded her arms and gave me that "you're dead to me" glare. For a moment, I really thought my story would end right there, with me decorating the dungeon floor. But then, miracle, the cook muttered, "This one's too stupid to be a thief." Not exactly a compliment, but it saved my skin. The steward snarled, warned me that one more slip and you're done, and shoved me back to work. I never looked at figs the same way again. That wasn't the only trial. Servant life was basically one long obstacle course. You could be punished for speaking too loud, for walking in the wrong hallway, for looking at the wrong person, especially the Lord's family. Oh, there were rules. No eye contact unless spoken to. No speaking unless asked. Always bow. Always step aside. Always keep your head down. One time I was carrying a tray through the corridor when I almost bumped into the lady of the castle. She was all silks and jewels, gliding like she floated instead of walked. My knees locked up, my brain froze, and I nearly dropped the tray. I managed a clumsy bow, muttered something that was supposed to be "my lady," and backed into the wall like an idiot. She didn't even look at me. To her, I was less than the stone under her feet. Knights weren't much better. They strutted around like roosters, armor clanking, voices booming. Some treated us like invisible shadows. Others, let's just say they enjoyed their power a little too much. A spilled drink meant a cuff to the ear, a dirty floor, a kick with their iron boots. And we had to smile, or at least not cry loud enough to get noticed. But the real weight of the castle wasn't just in the chores or punishments. It was in the whispers. The walls seemed to hum with secrets. War was brewing somewhere beyond the horizon. The Lord's allies weren't so loyal. A messenger had arrived with news, but only the high table knew what it said. Servants weren't supposed to know, but gossip seeped through cracks faster than smoke. One night, while scrubbing the great hall, I overheard two stewards muttering near the fire. Words like betrayal, siege, and gold unpaid. My ears perked up, but I kept my head down, pretending to polish the floor. My heart hammered in my chest. The nobles played games of power, but it was always us servants who ended up suffering when things went wrong. Still, I couldn't help myself. Every secret I overheard, every hint of intrigue, it made me feel like I was part of something bigger. Dangerous, sure, but thrilling. In quiet moments when I wasn't running around like a headless chicken, I let myself dream. I dreamed of leaving the castle, seeing the world beyond its walls, maybe becoming a scribe, or even just a traveler with nothing but freedom. But then the steward's voice would thunder, the cook's spoon would smack the table, and reality would slap me harder than either of them. The truth was simple. I was a servant. I could dream all I wanted, but the grind, the punishments, the fear, that was my life, my fate, or so I thought, because deep down the castle was changing me. It was teaching me to endure, to keep my head down while still keeping my ears open. It was teaching me that behind every stone wall, there was a secret waiting to be uncovered. And one day I knew one of those secrets would drag me right into the heart of trouble. If there's one thing nobles loved more than bossing people around, it was throwing feasts. Big ones. The kind where the tables groaned under roasted meats, the wine flowed like rivers, and the musicians played until their fingers cramped. For us servants, though, a feast wasn't fun. It was war. The day started like usual, except multiplied by 10. Fires roared in every hearth, spits turned with whole animals sizzling, and the kitchen was chaos. Cooks shouted, pots boiled over, servants sprinted around like headless chickens. The steward paced back and forth, eyes sharp enough to catch a speck of dust from across the hall. My job? Carry platters, lots of them. By evening, the great hall was a vision. Tapestries lined the walls, candles flickered from iron chandeliers, and the long tables were loaded with everything from venison to pastries stuffed with honey. The lord and ladies sat at the high table, dressed like peacocks, while knights and guests filled the benches below. Laughter, clinking cups, music, it was all there. And me? I was the guy darting around with a tray, praying I didn't trip and bathe a noble in gravy. At first, everything went smoothly. Wine here, bread there, roasted boar down the center. The knights stuffed their faces, the ladies whispered behind jeweled hands, and I was just background noise. But then chaos arrived, literally, in the form of fire. It started in the kitchen. One of the younger boys had been stoking the hearth, maybe a little too eagerly, and the next thing we knew, flames were licking up the chimney and catching on the hanging herbs. Someone screamed, pots crashed, and smoke billowed out so thick it made your eyes sting. The alarm spread fast. Bells rang, voices shouted, and suddenly the feast was no longer laughter and music. It was panic. Guests leapt from benches, wine spilled, dogs barked, and I stood frozen with a tray of apples like, well, this escalated quickly. The steward barked orders, "Buckets! Water! Move, you fools!" And we moved. Buckets from the well, chains of servants running back and forth, sloshing water on the fire. My arms ached, my throat burned from smoke, but there was no stopping. The flames roared like a beast, hungry and wild, and for a terrifying moment I thought the whole castle might go up. Meanwhile, the nobles were being herded out of the hall, coughing and covering their faces. Some shouted about their clothes, their jewels, their reputations, while we were busy trying not to die. Typical. At one point, I nearly dropped from exhaustion. My tunic was soaked, my hands blistered from hauling buckets, and I could barely breathe. But when I looked around, I saw everyone else, boys, girls, old servants, all fighting just as hard. No one wanted to lose their home, no matter how harsh it was. Finally, after what felt like hours, the fire sputtered and died under a mountain of water and ash. The kitchen was blackened, the feast ruined, the guests furious. The cook sat on a stool, face streaked with soot, muttering curses that could peel paint. The steward looked like he'd aged 10 years. And me? I collapsed against a wall, chest heaving, smelling like smoke and despair. But here's the part I'll never forget. In that moment, watching the nobles storm and complain, while the servants sat there blackened and bruised, I realized something. Life in the castle wasn't just about serving. It was about surviving, together. We might have been invisible most days, but when fire came, it was our hands that saved the walls, not the Lord's jeweled fingers. Of course, the next morning, things went back to normal. Orders shouted, chores resumed, punishments handed out. The nobles pretended nothing had happened except maybe to complain about the feast being spoiled. But for us servants, something had shifted. We'd stared chaos in the face and kept the castle standing. And me, I carried more than smoke scars. I carried the knowledge that no matter how invisible we were the backbone of the castle. Without us, the walls would crumble, the fires would consume, and the nobles would be helpless. That was both empowering and depressing. Empowering because we mattered. Depressing because they'd never admit it. Still, the fire etched itself into my memory like nothing else. The heat, the smoke, the fear, the chaos. It was the first time I truly felt the danger of castle life. It wasn't all feasts and nights and fancy gowns. It was survival, pure and simple. And deep down, I knew this wouldn't be the last trial the castle threw at me. Looking back, sometimes I wonder how I survived those years in the castle. Not because of war or bandits or some big dramatic battle, but because of the daily grind that wore you down like water dripping on stone. Funny how it's the little things, the endless scrubbing, the constant hunger, the backaches, that can break a person more than swords or fire. After the great fire in the kitchen, life didn't slow down. If anything, it doubled. Walls needed scrubbing, smoke stains scraped off, supplies restocked. Nobles pretended nothing had happened, like the fire was just an inconvenience. Meanwhile, we were the ones patching the place back together with blistered hands. But that's the rhythm of a servant's life. Disaster one day, chores the next. No glory, no reward, just survival. Years passed like that. At first, I counted the days, thinking maybe one day I'd escape, or someone would notice me, or my fate would magically change. Spoiler, it didn't. Instead, the seasons rolled on, winter after winter, feast after feast. My hands grew calloused, my back bent, and my childhood dreams shrank until they were no bigger than the crumbs I swept from the Lord's table. Sometimes when travelers came through, I overheard them talking about the castle. To them, it was a place of power, of luxury, of shining knights and noble ladies. They'd stare at the towers in awe, point at the banners, and whisper about the glorious life inside. I always wanted to laugh, if only they knew. If only they could smell the kitchens after a week without fresh herbs, or see the sores on the scullery maid's hands, or feel the straw beds scratching your skin every night. The castle wasn't a dream, it was a grindstone, and we were the ones being worn down. And yet, it wasn't all misery. Strange, isn't it? There were moments I'll never forget, and not all of them bad. The sunrise over the battlements, painting the fields gold. The laughter of servants sneaking a joke while the steward's back was turned. The hush that fell when the musicians struck up a song in the hall. Even the smell of bread baking, if you ignored the smoke, could feel like a small gift on a cold morning. We found ways to endure, even to belong. Friendships forged in exhaustion, jokes whispered in the dark, secrets traded like treasure. We were invisible to the nobles, sure, but not to each other. And in a strange way, that gave us strength. What about me? Did I ever rise above? Not really. I didn't become a knight or a scribe or run away to live some daring life on the road. My fate stayed tied to those stone walls. And maybe that's not the story people want to hear. They want triumph, escape, glory. But the truth? For most servants, survival was the triumph. Each year lived was a victory. Each winter endured a medal. Each scar proof that you'd kept going. Sometimes I think outsiders will never understand. To them, castles are fairy tales. To me, they're smoke, sweat, aching bones, and a life lived in shadows. But they're also where I laughed, where I worked, where I grew old. It was harsh, but it was home in its own strange way. So if you ask me now, all these years later, what I remember most, it's not the lords or ladies, not the feasts or the nights. It's the people in the kitchens, the stables, the cellars, the ones who hauled, scrubbed, bled, and kept the place alive. We may not be in the songs, but without us, there'd be no castle to sing about. And maybe that's enough.